مصلحة العباد. You see what I mean? And this is really common, that I would find that people not understanding fiqh, that fiqh is all about understanding, one, the rationality behind the text and the context in where how both are actually applied together. That's what fiqh is. So it's not a rigid text where you're just thinking of that text, the emotion of the text, without actually thinking, well, let's think about the rationality behind it, the intellect behind it, the paradigm, because الشريعة مصلحة كلها. Sharia is all about ensuring people's rights, justices, and also considering the consequences that might actually affect people's deen, people's health, people's mental health, people's chastity, and people's wealth and property. So oftentimes you can see, to answer that one, you can see a lot of times women, because they didn't study fiqh, oftentimes they don't always attend the masajid. I don't really know the reason to it, but I do find a lot of women, even when they want to be religious, it's really sad to say that they lack fiqh. They will be very very emotional / utopian in their connection with the text, without taking consideration that the text itself, especially fiqh, is actually a connection between, yes, your emotions, but there's also a stance in where al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. Whenever there is a judgment, it's all based upon the data that is relating to that circumstance. So it's not just, here's the text and you're just going to apply it despite the circumstance. There are certain circumstances that you really have to learn fiqh to see that there are actually so many different ends, so many different considerations that must be taken into consideration to make sure that you're bringing in al-maslaha. To bring in al-maslaha, whether we're talking about the benefit for people's health, for people's wealth, for people's chastity, for people's mental health, all of these things must be taken into consideration, because if we don't take in consideration, then in that situation, there's no fiqh. Fiqh is all about taking in consideration all of these issues. That's what fiqh is. And unfortunately, we do see that it is very common. To answer that question, we do see that oftentimes women can commit, I would say, commit that type of emotional relationship, and which is what I meant by utopian, an emotional relationship where there isn't fiqh.
Intellectual.
Exactly.
Reasoning, which
exactly.
Fiqh
is about the verb faqaha actually means to comprehend, to understand. And that's why if somebody learned only one madhab, I've got a problem with that. Because when you learn fiqh and you learn the various madhab, it's amazing. I really mean it. The fuqaha, and I don't know how to say this, but the science of fiqh really impresses me, because how they can come about with so many different rulings, and how they could go deep into the text and deep in each and every single word and understand there's different circumstances. You see, what happens is that many times people are taking one matter and then they become so rigid. And it's like, this is the ruling. And then you discover that there are so many different interpretations that are one within the text, within the hadith, within the ayat, or even the circumstances. And the way that the scholars of fiqh had derived rulings and even thought about it is impressive. Impressive. In where I don't know how to explain it. When you take, for example, take Kitab al-Mabsut for Sarakhsi. Al-Kitab al-Mabsut for Sarakhsi is about 21 volumes. All right. 21 volumes, give or take, depends on the copy. Okay. And you take just that book, and it's just for a Hanafi madhab. All right. We didn't even go for Radd al-Muhtar. Okay. You've got just 21 volumes in where they would discuss so many different things, and especially the Hanafi madhab. I mean, I'm not necessarily Hanafi madhab, but especially the Hanafi madhab in how they set a type of coding. It's like a type of laws. They're like elements. So smart. They're like these elements, these codes, a type of a way of setting out all these qawaid fiqhiyya. And they didn't necessarily 100, they're not like the Hanafi, the Hanbalis and Shafi'is. The Hanbalis and Shafi'is, I would say more, Salafi in terms of text. And what I mean by Salafi in that regard is very strict on text. The Hanafis, in the beginning of their development, they didn't actually have the complete access, although the Hanafi madhab, I mean, Abu Hanifa himself actually died 150 year Hijrah. So when we're talking about historically speaking, he's actually the earliest, because Imam Malik died 179. You're talking about Imam Shafi'i died 205. When you look at these 205, when you look at just the chronology of it, but here's one thing that is not within these numbers, is that during that time, you've got one, the geographical context, where Abu Hanifa was actually in Baghdad. And Iraq was an area of turbulences, an area of multi-religions, an area of multi-races, multi-religions, multi-civilizations that actually had a long history. I mean, until the time of today, Iraq is a whole world on its own, a whole world. Now that actually made it harder on Imam Abu Hanifa to actually have access to the resources / the textual resources. Yet when you look at Imam Malik, he was actually living in Medina. In fact, he was called Imam Dar al-Hijrah. He didn't even leave Medina. And that's why it is part of his legal maxims and the resources in where he considers Amal Ahl al-Medina, the actions of Ahl al-Medina, and regard it, well, he's my reference. The people of Ahl al-Medina, they unanimously and have a trace that goes back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. After all, Imam Malik, I mean, he died 179 Hijriya. The Prophet ﷺ died 11 Hijriya. In other words, he had actually met with some of the Tabi'een. I mean, this is Imam Malik, all right? So you're talking about where he met with some of the Tabi'een, in other words, just his grandfather. Exactly, Tabi'een. And well, one thing is that, yes, he did have that access, but Imam Shafi'i, on the other hand, he happened to, yes, die 205 Hijriya, but there was still, at that time, there was somewhat of like a revolution to gather the ahadith, to record them, to get into that type of documentation. So what Imam Shafi'i had access to was a type of documentation where other people were doing the job in documenting the hadith, and which hadith, well, some Sahaba, you might say, well, I mean, Imam Malik was in Medina, so why would we actually need all that documentation? We can have the closest documentation, that is, Sanad al-Ali. But here's one thing, is that a lot of the Sahaba had actually lived outside of Medina because they were busy being the pioneers, the mujahideen, elsewhere. So they would go to Maru, they would go to Egypt, they would go to faraway countries that Imam Malik never left Medina but to Hajj once and stayed there forever. That is in Medina. Never left. In other words, he didn't have access to all the ahadith that were heard by Ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Those were actually far away because they had left Medina many years back. So who had that ilm? It was really the Abu Hanifa, or probably Layth ibn Sa'd, or probably they were actually far away and probably Samarkand and who knows where. He didn't even have access to that. So when we actually speak about studying fiqh, we're actually talking about studying even the other opinions. That's why it's really amazing when you, for example, you see Ibn al-Arabi. And who's Ibn al-Arabi? It's not Ibn Arabi, the Sufi guy, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, but it's actually Ibn al-Arabi. And he's a Maliki scholar, okay, a great Maliki scholar. And in his book, it's called Ahkam al-Quran. Ahkam al-Quran, his book is 5 volumes, 6 volumes, okay? It's it really just goes into the ayat that relate to ahkam. Just the ayat that relate to Islamic rulings, really. That's his focus. And you would see how he would go to the other scholars, including, and this is fiqh, because fiqh is about researching the way other scholars had also derived and went deep in detail into the wording, because you don't want to just depend on one scholar and be so rigid. No matter how great that scholar is, at the end of the day, he's a human being. Somebody else might have actually thought about the ayat, thought about the words, connected certain other texts that one scholar didn't get to probably the inspiration to see, really. It's that simple. So when you see the other scholars, and like Ibn al-Arabi, when he was discussing, even though he's Maliki madhab, but he was looking into the ayah, وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ. Now, وَآتُوا حَقَّهُ يَوْمَ حَصَادِهِ, it's a very general term that you're supposed to give the rights of that harvest, or the rights of the rights of that produce / harvest that you actually harvest on the day that you harvest it. Now, scholars actually debated whether zakah is only limited in certain items or whether it's expanded to other items as well, whether we're talking about apples, bananas, whatever it is, or whether it's strictly, and in other words, it's limited to certain items. But when you look at other scholars, they can be rigid and consider just their madhab. And sometimes, believe it or not, they can be so rigid on a fatwa that it is only their madhab, that they're not willing to negotiate or even accept someone else's, just like al-Jassas, even though great Hanafi scholar, but will not accept any other opinion and will regard any other opinion as just really off the trace for the Prophet. But Ibn al-Arabi, when he looked at that, and he said, as for Abu Hanifa, he really had used the Quran and made the Quran be the lens that he sees through, even though he's a scholar from another madhab. And he said, and Abu Hanifa had said that everything, fi kulli ma akhrajat al-ard zakah, everything that the land produces, there's zakah in it. Now, that's basically a fair statement in even how he had praised Abu Hanifa, that when you want to study fiqh, it's not about being rigid to a person. It's about wanting to know the text and the context. Now, that's fiqh. Fiqh, because al-haq.
Spread across.
Exactly. Well, al-haq, at the end of the day, يعرف الرجال بالحق ولا يعرف الحق بالرجال. You want to know truth? You don't know truth because someone said it. It's not an issue of someone said such a thing and therefore it is true. It's actually, I need to see how men apply the truth and how they derive and use the text to understand truth. And this is extremely important. And that's what Shafi'i was always saying. It's like, the way we actually get and delve into the text is really based on the evidences that it is supported by it. And it supports, it's not an issue of who said what. And this fanaticism can also be seen and found even in scholars of fiqh, believe it or not. So when we study fiqh, it's really important to learn. Absolutely. It's really important to, can you give me a bottle? It's really important to learn all the different fuqaha. المجموع للنووي Nawawi actually died at almost 43, 42 years old. So quite young, really. That's really my age. I consider him young. Or is it because it's my age?
No, it's young.
It's young.
Kids who think that's old.
Right. Okay. There you go. So if it's 80, double my age, then it would be old, right? So when you look at Nawawi, he actually wrote Al-Majmu'. Now, Al-Majmu' is, if it were to be completed, he died before completing it. And the Al-Majmu', somebody else, yes, completed it, but Al-Majmu' itself, what he tried to do, he tried to go to every single chapter in fiqh and really see the details in studying fiqh and considering the differences of opinions between scholars and looking at the preponderant and making as much as he can a fair statement in regarding these different opinions. If he were, and he didn't even complete it, so he did almost 16 volumes, but then later somebody else completed as much as they can, trying to take the pedagogy and the method of a Nawawi. Didn't quite do the same, but still, I mean, when you're looking at 16 volumes and only got to Bab al-Zakah, in other words, he still didn't get to all the different chapters, because when we're talking about fiqh, if we were to split it, okay, you've got the first one is going to be fiqh, okay, not the other ones, but fiqh. You're going to talk about Bab al-Tahara, and then you're going to talk about Salah, then you're going to talk about Zakah, then you're going to talk about Siyam, then you're going to talk about Hajj, etc. And then you're going to talk about the transactions, and then you're going to talk about marriage, then you're going to talk, all right, Kitab al-Nikah, and then you're going to talk about Libas, Slide, etc. And then you're going to talk about Al-Fara'id. You're going to continue that way. So in other words, he didn't even pass from fiqh, not even, let's see, give or take. So if I were to put it in 20 volumes, all fiqh, like in Mufassal fi Ahkam al-Mar'a for Abd al-Karim Zaidan, it's in 21 volumes, all right? And so the first 4 volumes were about al-ibadat, which is worship, all right? In Nawawi did all of that in 16 volumes. You see it right there? This is just to give you an idea. I love that part about numbers, and I'm somebody that's visual. It's like, okay, how does that actually look in numbers? Go ahead, Sister Maimuna.
So that's because he was taking from all the madhab or what?
Right, that was because he was taking from all the madhab and really researching all the madhab. But mind you that in Nawawi is actually Shafi'i madhab. In fact, a Shafi'i madhab for the Shafi'iyya, it's in Nawawi. So we've got a Shafi'i, but a Shafi'i didn't actually, let me say, record all the Shafi'i madhab. All right. So Shafi'i was taking in pretty much the legal maxims for the Shafi'i madhab. So putting it like some type of a coding. All right. And then you later had other scholars that were pretty much using this foundation for the Shafi'i madhab and then would continue. So whenever you would see a dispute on what is the Shafi'i madhab, they'll go to Rafi. But if a situation where there's a Rafi'i and you've got a Nawawi disputing on what really is the statement and the final preponderant opinion on the Shafi'i madhab, right away they'll go to Nawawi. So Nawawi is the major sheikh of a Shafi'i madhab. So if you want to talk about Shafi'i madhab, you cannot skip in Nawawi, period. You cannot skip in Nawawi. One main reason is because in Nawawi, he delved and went deeper than just what might be traced back to actually say, well, let me see the other madhahib. Let me see the other researches and let me use the coding for the Shafi'i madhab and apply it right there. Think of it as math. It's exactly like math. When you talk about fiqh, it's exactly like engineering and math. Exactly like engineering and math, because it's all about understanding the idea for the math rule, and then you're applying the details of those formulas.
Just plugging it in.
You're plugging it in, exactly. Because if you don't actually have the paradigm set and you don't have the formula set, you're going to confuse all your numbers. You don't know what you're doing. It's all about engineering is like that. Physics is like that. It's like, do you understand where you're going? Do you understand what the formula is supposed to get you? Do you understand when to use what formula and how to use it to get what? What are you trying to get to? And that's exactly the same thing. When you look at fiqh, it's beyond just being rigid to a text. It's letting the text give you the formula and letting and understanding let me say the context of the text. And I don't mean by context, the context and how it was revealed, but I'm talking about the context, meaning the intellect and the reasoning and the legal maxims behind the text. That requires thinking farther than just a rigid focus and just seeing a very narrow or a shallow or even, some form of a face value. It's actually going deep inside. And that's amazing when you actually talk about fiqh. I can go really, I'm going to end up, just when I speak of fiqh, it all of a sudden feels like I'm, I don't know, it just feels like, you're talking about, I don't know, the sweetest thing ever. It's just amazing. It's
Aysha, I have another question about the celebration of
the Mawlid.
Yes. In
Okay.
Africa, we emphasize that, like in the West, we emphasize that a lot. And I think they do Africa mostly is Maliki. So
Right.
Imam Malik was in Medina most of the time. So did he celebrate?
So
did he
the
actually-
celebration that actually happens in North Africa is not necessarily because of Maliki. The celebration that happens in North Africa because of the Tijani Tariqa and the Sufi. Okay, so it's not because of Maliki. Because if we are to say that bid'ah, it traces back to Maliki, that is definitely a defamation for Imam Malik, because Imam Malik, out of all, I would say was actually the most Salafi. And what I mean by Salafi, that wanted to take his madhab and take his fatwa to actually trace back to Salaf al-Salih, to actually mean the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. Well, that's why he even was keeping his own jug of what a sa' would be like, and was considering Amal Ahl al-Madina, the actions of Ahl al-Madina, as a considerable resource for the reference, considerable resource and a reference. So to actually consider that, oh yeah, well, this is actually tracing back to Maliki, I wouldn't say that that's at all something that Imam Malik would at all want to hear. It's like, he'd definitely be the first to object to this. But in terms of Mawlid, there are two sides to it. Number one is that, did the Prophet ﷺ do this type of Mawlid, this type of celebration where he would celebrate the day of his birth in that way? Well, one is that the Prophet ﷺ did actually tell us that it is a special day in where he said, well, he was fasting Mondays because that's the day he was born in. but you could see that it's not that he celebrated it in a way that it is a Eid. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was really keen and assuring that that Muslims only have two Eids, when he actually made it clear to that Sahabi, and he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had replaced you two better days than this day, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. It's really clear about it. All right. But you could see that he also considered, he said, well, that Monday, that was the day that I was born in, and he would fast Mondays. But the first wahi, what we know is, yes, Monday, but one thing is that when you actually look at in terms of, oh, Allah barik fiki, when you look at in terms of celebration, all right, it would definitely be a bid'ah to celebrate other than Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr. There's no doubt that it would be a bid'ah. Absolutely. So to make a celebration and sweets and make it all of that, the whole idea and the concept of celebrating il-Mawlid was really only introduced by the Fatimids. The Fatimids, and this actually explains why North Africa, the Fatimids, or Ubaidiyya to be more accurate, they were actually a Shia sect that actually controlled a number of different areas in North Africa, including Egypt. They were the Ubaidiyya that controlled we're talking about majority was actually Sunni, but they actually controlled those areas in order to gain popularity. They were actually introducing such things in order to give themselves the appearance that they were really in favor. They were in favor of the Prophet ﷺ, that they actually had some introduction. So it was really introduced by the Ubaidiyya at the time. And the Ubaidiyya was really ruling North Africa. So we're looking at those North Africa, Egypt, Libya, part of Tunisia, etc. And well, part of Tunisia, not all, well, they actually attempted to enter Tunisia, but at the end of the day is that's where it actually came in. All right. Now, what people don't recognize is the history of things. And Ubaidiyya was centuries after the Prophet. So is it really a bid'ah? Absolutely. There's no doubt that it's a bid'ah. But would I necessarily say that it's a bid'ah where, yes, everything in it is a bid'ah? Not quite. I would definitely use that day, or let me call it abuse that day, to introduce the history of the Prophet ﷺ to, and do classes probably about the biography of the Prophet ﷺ to the masses, because we're getting people on that day coming in. If we're not going to, on that day, explain the life of the Prophet ﷺ, or probably teach them about the life of the Prophet ﷺ on that day, it's supposed to be every day and not exclusive to al-Mawlid. It's supposed to be every single day, not exclusive to al-Mawlid. But is it, despite the fact that al-Mawlid, to mean, is it Rabi' al-Awwal on that day, Monday, etc.? Is it really on that day? We don't really know the exact date. All right, we don't really know the exact date. So if we're talking about reference, we don't really know the exact date that this is al-Mawlid. And the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahaba, they never celebrated al-Mawlid to mean that this is your birthday, let's make a happy cake and start blowing the candles and all of that. That's definitely not something that the Prophet ﷺ himself had practiced. And in fact, even the Prophet ﷺ, when he talked about the practices of the Christians, he definitely emphasized that he did not want the Muslims to in any way praise the Prophet ﷺ over other prophets, not even Yunus ibn Matta, and he literally said, "لا تطروني كما طرت اليهود كما طرت النصارى عيسى ابن مريم." Don't overpraise me the way that Christians had overpraised Isa ibn Maryam. how do they praise him? Well, they would make a celebration, and yes, they ended up, well, considering at the level of a divine creature, and etc. And the list goes on and on. So at the end of the day is that as Muslims, we should be really careful in how, yes, we embrace the Prophet ﷺ. And even if we wanted to, whether it's fasting on a Monday or whether it's, telling the history of the Prophet ﷺ, that wouldn't be a bid'ah, because that's supposed to be the Muslim practice every single day, to talk about the history of the Prophet ﷺ, to talk about the Sunnah, to talk about the Shama'il, for example, explain the Shama'il, explain the different traits of the Prophet ﷺ, to connect the people with the Prophet ﷺ. So to use it in that sense, that wouldn't be a bid'ah. Shama'il is basically a book for Al-Qadi Iyad. Al-Qadi Iyad, he wrote a book, it's called the Shama'il for the Prophet ﷺ, in where he talks about the history of the Prophet ﷺ. It's pretty much like a huge volume of 750 pages almost. It's a huge book on the Prophet ﷺ and his life from early birth until death, and all the word Shama'il actually means the good traits of somebody. All right, so it's basically talking about the good traits of the Prophet ﷺ. So to learn it on that day was actually a practice that was done in Africa. Shama'il, because Al-Qadi Iyad was from Morocco. All right, Al-Qadi Iyad was from Morocco. Al-Qadi Iyad is really rather interesting. I'm going to get a little bit off. Al-Qadi Iyad, and I think I mentioned the story somewhere else. Al-Qadi Iyad, all right, his father wanted him to be a scholar. Little boy, born. His father, I want this kid to be a scholar when he grows up. So one day, every single day, he would come back home and say, did you feed him halal? Yes. The wife would say, I fed him halal. All right, good. Every single day. It's like, in order to get him to become a scholar, he needs to feed halal. That's all that he, at least for early infancy, that's all I need. That's all we can afford to do right now. Just feed him halal. So one day, the other kids in the neighborhood insisted to take young Iyad with them to play. He's a little cute baby, and we would like to take him with us. So indeed, they took him with them. Who knows what kind of games they were playing. But in the neighborhood, the kids were playing, but the little toddler Iyad was crying. He wants to go home. But the kids didn't want to take him back home. It's a little bit too far. So they decided, we don't want to take him home. Let's just somehow get him busy with something else. A woman from the neighborhood, she basically sees Iyad crying. She was like, I'll just nurse him. So she did. She nursed him. And Iyad was, okay, now he's completely fed. He comes back home. And then he's asking, was he fed halal? And she said, well, the kids took him on, figure it out. He goes and asks the kids, did he feed anything? Well, yeah, there was that lady, she nursed him because he was crying. So what does he do? The father puts his fingers in his mouth, in the baby's mouth, makes him literally vomit every single thing, but he didn't vomit everything. So later, Iyad, when he became Al-Qadi Iyad, he said every time he would lisp, and sometimes he would get his words probably, tangled or stuff like that. He would say, it's the remaining of that nursing that my dad did not manage to get out of me. تلك البقية الباقية من تلك الرضا.
Such a great story.
It's amazing. You would never, it's like every time, his words somehow, they just doesn't come out right. You're like, oh, it's actually the remaining of that day that my dad, he tried, but he's a little baby. He's a little baby. So, just a question, what have we been feeding ourselves that's making us not be as eloquent, not be able to memorize, not be able to do what we need to do? We really need to figure out a lot of our diets, right? We need to figure out a lot of things. But subhanAllah, or even our parents, what did they feed us? I have no idea. She had It's really amazing. You know, it's subhanallah, you know, when you look at Al-Qadi Iyad, and he wrote a Shama'il, and of course he was one major scholar for the Maliki madhab.
He's the author of that book.
He's the author for that book. Yep, he's the author for Shifa, Shama'il, I mean Shama'il, and the Shifa. What was that?
It's halal, so the entire
Exactly. There you go. You've got Shama'il, you've got Shifa, and Shama'il was for Tirmidhi as well. Tirmidhi has a different story, but or different stories. All right,
So
let's.
the author of that book was the one that you
Shifa,
Shamal,
Shifa, Al-Qadi Iyad. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I have the book. I have Shamal.
Shama'il is for Tirmidhi, Shifa for Qadi Iyad. So those two books were actually relating to the same topic. All right, let's continue. Yeah, Surah An-Nisa, you could see, of course, Surah An-Nisa. Let's just look at it right there. And from the top that you could actually see, let's look at it right there. You've got Surah An-Nisa, and it says that's basically this fourth surah, and it is 176 ayat. And of course, we know that Surah Al-Imran was 200 ayat. All right? So, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اصبروا وصابروا ورابطوا واتقوا الله لعلكم تفلحون. Well, Surah Al-Imran ends with اتقوا الله لعلكم تفلحون, and Surah An-Nisa starts with يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم. Same thing. And this is extremely important because the surahs, even their ending and even the topics, they actually relate to one another. Surah Al-Imran, we saw how it was discussing the foundation of thought, the foundation of focus, was also giving a certain repetition in terms of dhikr, how to stay in contact, how to stay in focus. And of course, the second part, and this is important to mention, that in Islam, the way that you build your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually stands on one, figuring out your focus. Whether we're talking about focus and understanding Tawheed, or whether we're talking about how you apply the different understanding. Why do I go through trauma? What do I have to do in terms of understanding the world around me? Why am I created? So here's number 3, understanding who you are, what you are, and the purpose of life. So that's the focus. Let's do it again. When we're talking about focus, we're branching it out. Maybe I should actually do it right there. Okay, here we go. So number 1 is really focus. When we're talking about focus, we're actually branching it out on a number of different things. So first focus is really understanding. Number 1 is the part about Tawheed. That's the first focus. Understanding Tawheed, who you're worshiping. All right. Who is Allah? And you can't understand these if you don't understand who you are. Why? Because by understanding your ubudiyyah, by understanding your Lord, you'll understand your ubudiyyah. What does that mean? By recognizing who Allah is in His names and attributes, that's when you will recognize who you are. What does that mean? When you look at the name Allah, Al-Ilah, the God, the deity, you are Al-Abd. You are the servant. You look at the name Al-Khaliq, you are Al-Makhluq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Al-Khaliq, He's the creator. You are Al-Makhluq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Raziq. He's the one that gives you rizq. You are the person that is marzuq. You're the one that's given the rizq. And the list goes on and on. He is Al-Wahid. You are going to be, there are multiple of you. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. إياك نعبد. The duality. The duality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Wahid. You are, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells you that He created the whole universe in the system of binary. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is non-binary. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala non-binary. But you come in dhikr and untha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's al-Aziz. You are the person that will either get al-izzah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or dhillah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or humiliation. And the list goes on and on. So that's the first part, putting your focus in place. Now, part of that is understanding, okay, well, who you are, that's one side of it, but there's also the side in understanding how different things apply onto you. Why? Because lahu maqalidu samawati wal ard. He's the one that controls all the different forces on earth, whether we're talking about al-haya, whether we're talking about life, whether we're talking about death, whether we're talking about al-nasr, al-hazima, victory, defeat. All the different forces are actually applied onto you. Trauma, pain, illness, all these different things. You basically connect it. You put the focus that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that actually controls all of that. It's connected to Tawheed. Now, the other thing, when we're talking about these areas, well, we actually put all of them together right there. The other thing right here is basically that part about repetition. Why repetition? Because with focus, you're putting in that Tawheed. In order to get your focus in place, yes, this actually is the mental side, but the mental side is not enough. There's also the spiritual side. And what I mean by the spiritual side, the ibadah side. And where? Dhikr. That's a dhikr right there. What is a dhikr? A dhikr, whether we're talking about a dhikr to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentally, to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orally, to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even through your hearing, to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even through seeing the creation and the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a dhikr. So the word dhakara can mean to remember, dhakara, and which is what brings in repetition, dhakara to mean to mention orally, dhakara can also mean to hear and even say, and dhakara to bring into focus. Okay, in other words, remember. So that's why we would do salah repeated, siyam repeated, hajj repeated. Number of things where it's in order to bring in your focus in place. The other one is basically the behavioral part. In order to bring in your spiritual connection, taqwa connection, you definitely need to put in number one, which is al-iman al-aqidah, with your focus. Number two, when it comes to ibadah, but then that's not enough, because your behavior, what you do in your relationship, whether we're talking about transactions, whether we're talking about marriage, whether we're talking about governance, whether we're talking about your relationship with the society, all of that is basically related to the behavior. That's why when you look at Surah Al-Ma'arij, if you look at Surah Al-Ma'arij, you split Surah Al-Ma'arij, yes, and then it goes, and then it basically takes you into, go to the second page, what does it take you to? It takes you into, well, الذين هم على صلاتهم دائمون. After it goes into صلاتهم على صلاتهم دائمون, then والذين في أموالهم حق معلوم. It tells you, well, this is what a believer is. They're always consistent with their prayers, and then there's money that they understand that they have to contribute, because you cannot separate these. But a very interesting thing, once it goes into that, yes, then it will basically tell you about the relationship, sexual relations, how they would actually practice it. وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَى أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. And then it goes and tells you, well, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. Why? Because it wants to tell you, well, you've got an integrity to practice. There's an integrity. You cannot separate religiosity with the way that you relate with the society around you. You can't. What is amanatihim wa ahdihim? Al-amana is integrity, is trust. Al-ahd is a promise. You can't break a promise. Ra'un, they take it in consideration. They take it in consideration. And then it goes, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ بِشَهَادَاتِهِمْ قَائِمُونَ. Why بِشَهَادَاتِهِم? Well, because they don't give fraud witnesses. This is a serious matter. In other words, they're people of integrity, honesty, trust, and the most important thing, honesty. And then it continues, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَى صَلَاتِهِمْ يُحَافِظُونَ. They're still consistent with their prayer. In other words, what it wanted to say, it was really, yes, there's the سأل سائل بعذاب واقع, there's the part about focus, but then it tells you, well, wait a minute, I also want you to consider that your behavior, whether on a personal level with your spirituality, or whether on a social level, or whether it is on a personal private level between you and your wife or even your concubine, that you take that behavior because you cannot separate it from the influences and the implications it has on your spirituality. There's no way. It's all connected. It's all connected. The way you deal with the people in public and the way you deal on a personal level in your own bedroom, all of that is going to affect your focus. It's going to affect your focus. It's going to affect your religiosity. You can't claim to be a person of integrity when in your own bedroom you're otherwise. When in your transactions and when you buy things, you're otherwise. You cannot claim to be a person of integrity, because integrity is not to be split. Honesty is not to be split. When you're honest, you're honest. You're genuinely honest all the time. When you're a person of justice, you're a person of justice, whether it relates to you or whether it relates to others. You're a person of justice constantly. You're consistent with it. You're consistent with, that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. And don't let your tension or the tension between you and others be a barrier from acting justly. اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. Be just, because that is near to piety. Now that's extremely important. So I did actually have some people be, what's it called, be co-host. So the co-host, please do me a favor and add people, admit them, poor thing, they're all outside, out in the cold. You don't want to do that. All right, so Surah An-Nisa. Surah An-Nisa is basically a surah that is generally Madani. In fact, it's a Madani surah. Sayyidah Aysha in the Hadith, she actually said that Surah An-Nisa was not revealed until she was married to the Prophet. She was married to the Prophet. And Sayyidah Aysha was not married to the Prophet except when the Prophet went to Medina. All right? Because anyways, she was too young. And before she went to Medina, she was already betrothed to Jubayr ibn Mut'im, ibn Adi ibn Mut'im. She was already betrothed. She was engaged to someone else. You guys know the story? No. You don't know the story? Okay, so Sayyidah Aisha was engaged to Jubayr ibn Mut'im ibn Adi. Who's that? Mut'im, or Adi ibn Mut'im, he basically was one of the main chieftains that was supporting the Prophet ﷺ, even though he wasn't Muslim. When the people of Quraysh had taken over, of course, upon them to persecute anybody that embraced Islam, what the people of Quraysh had done was attack the Muslims and basically do like a curfew. They combine them all, and there was a curfew where no one is allowed to buy and sell from them. In other words, an economical curfew, and also a social curfew. Don't even get married from them. And of course, a whole boycott on the Muslims. Remember the name Am al-Huzn, the year of al-Huzn? Although the naming itself is actually, the naming itself was not necessarily proven to be authentic in terms of the name, but it was common. It was a famous description for that day, or those years, or that year when the Muslims were boycotted. The day during those era, during that year, Abu Talib and even Sayyidah Khadija had actually died during that year due to the malnutrition that they were going through during that time. During that time, there was this chieftain who was supplying the Muslims, who was actually supplying the Muslims with different things, whether it's food, water, etc. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had his Sayyidah Aisha betrothed to his son, Jubayr. All right. But later, when it was time to migrate to Medina, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he felt that that relationship cannot continue because he wasn't Muslim. So he ended the engagement. All right. He ended the engagement between Sayyidah Aisha and Jubayr. Later, Jubayr did become Muslim, by the way, but it wasn't until almost 50 years hijrah. All right. So many years later. All right. But Sayyidah Aisha got married to the Prophet ﷺ when later they had migrated to Medina. All right. So Sayyidah Aisha said, Surah An-Nisa, it wasn't revealed until I was actually in Medina. We were actually in Medina. Yet one thing is that this ayah, starting with Ya Ayyuhan Nas, now mind you, the surahs that have Ya Ayyuhan Nas are usually Meccan surahs, but Surah Al-Baqarah 2 times, although a Madani surah, in 2 different ayat, Surah Al-Baqarah, although Madani, has Ya Ayyuhan Nas. So to generalize that every surah that has Ya Ayyuhan Nas is Meccan is not necessarily too accurate. Got it? Not necessarily too accurate. So what's the idea of Ya Ayyuhan Nas? So Ya Ayyuhan Nas, they're basically the surahs that during the time when the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca, people were not ready to listen. So the discourse of the ayat was always relating to all the masses, to all the people. It would always direct the words as to all the people. The verses are usually shorter because people were not even ready to hear. So you were giving short messages. Number 3, the Meccan surahs usually didn't contain legislature. They were more focused on aqidah, more focused on aqidah, creed, and mental, the part about mental understanding in terms of Quran and so forth. That's why you would look at, for example, Juz' Amma. Most of those ayat and most of those surahs are actually Meccan surahs. Most of them are Meccan. Short verses, all right? Go and talks to Aqidah, sticks to that point, and then moves on. Except when you look at, for example, maybe Surah Al-Nasr. Yes, that's a Madani for sure. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ. Well, that was actually revealed as the last surah, actually. The last surah ever to be revealed is إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ. That was the last thing. Surah Al-Bayyinah. So that's Meccan, Madani as well. So you've got just a few surahs, but generally they're all Meccan surahs. يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمْ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَّفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ, or in another قراءة تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلَيْكُمْ رَقِيبًا. Now, I'm going to first read the ayah, okay, just give a surfaced translation. So, O people, fear your Lord Almighty, the one that created you from one soul and created from it its spouse, and through it he had disseminated and spread many men and women. So fear the Lord Almighty that you will be asked about, and the relatives. The Lord Almighty is supervising everything. A very shallow interpretation, very, very shallow interpretation. Let's go deeper down. Ya ayyuhan nasu ttaqu rabbakum. We talked about taqwa in the previous ayat. So why does it actually start with Ya ayyuhan nas ittaqu rabbakum? Because remember in Surah Al Imran, it actually ended with Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu isbiru wa sabiru wa rabitu wattaqullaha la'allakum tuflihun. Because in Surah Al Imran, it basically ended with taqwa and reminding you of taqwa and reminding you to actually have sabr and to actually have that consistency and also jihad. But then when we're talking about jihad and consistency and so forth, it's always telling you, well, I also want you to consider a number of different things in your relationships. Ya ayyuhan nas, oh people, have that taqwa, fear your Lord Almighty. What does it mean to fear God? To fear God, one, to take the words of the Lord Almighty serious because you recognize that the Lord Almighty has the power to control all the circumstances that surround you, and that He has the power to make things and realities snap when you decide to let go of certain principles. Too much of a long sentence for the word taqwa. Just to think of the idea. Now, this is extremely important because what usually people don't recognize is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you make a sin, He will not punish you right away, or at least the impact of that sin won't come to you right away. Same thing when we're talking about a good deed. Sometimes a good deed, you will get the reward right away in this dunya, and sometimes you will get it later. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He tells us, ittaqu rabbakum, it's basically taking in a consideration that the Lord Almighty rules everything and watches everything. In other words, you can run, but you can't hide from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You cannot hide from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because He's kana alaikum raqiba. Raqib actually means to be in complete supervision. He's scrutinizing everything. Everything is under His watch. Everything is under His scrutiny. Everything is under His sight. When you look at the Raqib is usually a person that stands up high and is watching everything. So kind of like a bird's eye. Is capable of seeing everything. This is a Raqib. Ittaqu rabbakum, where you're considering, okay, what should I do and have taqwa in? That's what we're going to get to. Okay, alladhi khalaqakum. So why should I have taqwa? Well, remember, He's the one that created you from one soul. Now, the word nafs can actually come in different meanings, because the word nafs, and this is very common, that people will actually speak of nafs as if it is one meaning. The word nafs, there is, yes, in nafs al-lawama, there's also in nafs al-mutma'inna, and there's also in nafs al-ammara bis-su. Now, here's one thing. In nafs itself can actually come in the Quran in different meanings. Sometimes in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even tells us to be careful from our own nafs. What does that mean? In where your own nafs can actually be acting as your own inner shaitan. Well, this is not in trying to advocate for the shaitan and say, don't blame the shaitan for everything. It can be your own nafs actually provoking you to do certain things against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So not always, again, I'm not here trying to defend shaitan and say, hey, don't blame the shaitan for it. We're here to say, maybe it's your nafs that you really need to work on. That's why tazkiyatin nafs is extremely important. Yes, understanding what shaitan's methods are is also important, but also having that tazkiyatin nafs is extremely important, because it could be what is actually taking over you without you recognizing. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, taqu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum min nafsin wahida, this is actually speaking, yes, about Adam alayhi salam. This is talking about Adam alayhi salam, but it is also referring Adam alayhi salam having Hawa or Eve created from his own rib. We know when the Prophet ﷺ actually tells us about the hadith, Adam alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Hawa from his own rib. Now, how we don't really know the details at the end of the day is that we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam as of course, the first human being. Okay. And in other words, he didn't evolve, but there were creatures before him. Were there? There were creatures before Adam alayhi salam.
Like a human or other things?
Well, is it like human? If you actually look at the ayah, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً قالوا أتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء. What did they say? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the malaika, I'm going to create a creation. And the malaika questioned, are you going to create a creation that's going to cause destruction and bloodshed? If this was referring to the jinn don't actually have blood. All right. So obviously there was a creation before Adam alayhi salam that somehow didn't have the intellect that Adam has / humans have. What's the evidence? In where when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them this, they said, well, تجعل فيها ما يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح بحمدك. Look, we do the tasbih. In other words, they recognize that the main duty that any creation is supposed to be doing is really al-ubudiyya lillah, servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ, and we glorify you. They understood. So why did they go into the bloodshed? Because they understood that applying justice is part of Tawheed. آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. It's part of Tawheed. So they introduced that, wait a minute, but there was already a creation that was causing injustice on earth, and we're already doing all the glorification. All right? But what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون وعلم آدم الأسماء كلها. What did Adam have that previous creation didn't have? علم. What is it? Intellect. التعليم. المعرفة. Idea of being able to understand. You see it? علم آدم الأسماء كلها ثم عرضهم على الملائكة. قال أنبئوني بأسماء هؤلاء. Talk about it. Tell me. Explain. Couldn't. Why? Because what malaika are not equipped with is intellect. They just apply what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them to do. But this creature actually has that ma'rifah, that ability to think.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
All right. So when you look at this, min nafsin wahida, all right, we recognize that at the end of the day is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Adam certain capacities that the other creation was not given. One, the capacity for intellect. Two, free will. Free will. Malaika don't have free will. The Malaika didn't have free will. Oh? And they recognized it. All right. So here, خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ. In order to recognize, you need to have taqwa in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, with a taqwa, this is the prelude in the ayah. This is the major prelude in the ayah. It's starting to tell you, it's like you do recognize it, but the prelude is the foundation, and where it's telling you, I want you to have taqwa, and I want you to remember that there's no distinction in the races. None of you are superior to the other, because you go back to nafsan wahida. In other words, it's putting in the foundation of the equity in where you're considering that whether خلقكم من نفس واحدة خلق منها زوجها, and even created from that nafs its own pair, that is Hawa. And from those you had many men wa nisa'a. So based on this ayah, you're actually seeing that it's basically telling you that there are more women than men. Women outnumber men. Why? Because when it says رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً, many men, وَنِسَاءً, this is actually putting it as right here, giving it, and yes, a large number, but it is limiting it to many. But nisa'a is not giving you a limit. So women outnumber men in statistics. The different statistics, you probably will have China, maybe India. Those are actually different. And the reason for that is really because of human interference. Human interference and causing abortion and probably, infanticide, etc. That's human interference. But if you were to actually let the human body and the nature itself that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, you will actually see the normal statistics is that women would outnumber men. Women in their population would outnumber men. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامَ. Wait a minute. So you said taqwa and you said taqwa. Let's look at it. So right here, ittaqullah, right there, ended with Surah Al-Imran. In this ayah, 2 times it's asking me to do taqwa. In what? وَاتَّقُوا الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامَ. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ, to emphasize this taqwa. What is the difference between taqwa rabbakum and ittaqullah? So when you say ittaqu rabbakum, the word Rabb is different than the word Allah, obviously, because the word Rabb is taking you in consideration, considering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the angle that He's the one that cherishes you, that He's the one that's taking care of all your matters. He's the one that's controlling all your matters. This ittaqullah, in where Him as a deity, the Lord Almighty as a deity, al-ilah. He is the deity, the God. But this one, the Lord. Rabb is the one that takes care of the matters. But al-ilah is the deity, is the one on top of everything. All right? On top of everything. الذي تساءلون به. What is الذي تساءلون? اتقوا الله الذي تساءلون. So half taqwa, الذي تساءلون, the one that you will be questioned about. والأرحام. Now here's one thing, is that when you look at this ayah, some scholars actually said والأرحام is an oath. And then they went into a debate in the books of Tafseer. If this is an oath, what is al-arham? Al-arham is a plural for a singular of al-rahim. Al-rahim is supposed to be the womb, okay? But this is not referring to wombs. This is not referring to wombs. This is actually referring to relatives, all right? Biological relatives. Al-arham are different than al-ashar. Al-arham are biological relatives. Your brothers, your sisters, your mother, your father, those are al-arham. Not necessarily exclusive to female relatives. Sometimes it can be exclusive to female relatives. Why? Because usually people will relate to one another based on benefit. I need this benefit from you. I'll call you. Hey, I need this much money. Here's what people would relate to one another whenever there is a benefit, whenever there's a mutual need, some kind of a trade-off. Women are usually the ones to be forgotten within the society. Why? Because women are usually investing within the family. There's not much that they can invest within the society usually. Usually, they're just busy with their children, busy with her husband. Her husband is taking over the leadership, etc. So her brothers, they would usually put her as a secondary thing because they would consider, well, there's not much that I can get out of her because at the end of the day, her husband's going to be responsible over her and there's not much that I can benefit from her. So that's why Islam is always emphasizing on silatul rahim, because the relationship in Islam is not based on how much benefit I can get from that person. It's not based on interest, but it's based on the integrity and the commitment and the genuine principle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set on earth. What's the evidence? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, قَالَ إِنَّ ابْنِي مِنْ أَهْلِي, my son, he's actually part of my family. In other words, no, it's indirectly saying, can I intercede for him somehow? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, no. إِنَّهُ لَيْسَ مِنْ أَهْلِكَ. Can't. He's not part of your family. Why? Because it was redefining that relationship is not about biological things. It's not about blood. It's a whole different dynamic. إنه ليس من أهلك. إنه عمل غير صالح. إني أعظك أن تكون من الجاهلين. Why الجاهلين? Because in Islam it was saying, well, maturity is going beyond a simplistic or a reductionist understanding of relations. It's going beyond. That's how you mature in your vision, in your relationship with people. That your relationship is not based on a blood relation. That's too reductionist. That's too simplistic. That's too shallow. Your relationship is actually based on the aqidah itself, the principle. Yeah, that was Hadith. That was my son.
Oh no, are we standing up for prayer now?
Exactly. So we'll continue, inshallah. We got to stop at this ayah at least, right?
No.
Today or
No.
now?
No? You want to continue?
Maybe you should do the second one.
There you go.
We were all waiting for the polygamy one.
You're all paid. I'll continue. My husband is actually in California, so we always say, "راح القط العب يا فار." You know what that means? In Palestinian, we say if the cat is gone, the mouse can play. Yeah, they're gonna start praying.
Oh, I thought they were going to start.
No, they're gonna start praying. Well, they did the iqama, right?
You did.
I'm not saying anything.
Yes, finally. I'm now gonna go on my tippy toes. Gonna make it up. The count is due.
I thought they were going to start.
Can you see?
Let me see. Let me go check. They're in line. They're about to start.
One, two, one, two.
Raqib, I hear you. Allah. الحمد لله رب العالمين
الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض ليجزي الذين أساءوا بما عملوا ويجزي الذين أحسنوا بالحسنى الذين يجتنبون كبائر الإثم والفواحش إلا اللمم إن ربك واسع المغفرة هو أعلم بكم إذ أنشأكم من الأرض وإذا أنتم أجنة في بطون أمهاتكم فلا تزكوا أنفسكم هو أعلم بمن اتقى أفرأيت الذي تولى وأعطى قليلا وأكدى أعنده علم الغيب فهو يرى أم لم ينبأ بما في صحف موسى وإبراهيم الذي وفى ألا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى وأن ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى وأن سعيه سوف يرى ثم يجزاه الجزاء الأوفى وأن إلى ربك المنتهى وأنه هو أضحك وأبكى وأنه هو أمات وأحيا وأنه خلق الزوجين الذكر والأنثى من نطفة إذا تمنى وأن عليه النشأة الأخرى وأنه هو أغنى وأقنى وأنه هو رب الشعرى وأنه أهلك عادا الأولى وثمود فما أبقى وقوم نوح من قبل إنهم كانوا هم أظلم وأطغى الله سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين والتين والزيتون وطور سينين وهذا البلد الأمين لقد خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم ثم رددناه أسفل سافلين إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات فلهم أجر غير ممنون فما يكذبك بعد بالدين أليس الله بأحكم الحاكمين الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
All right, you guys, we're going to continue helping this in the passing out chocolates. All right, let's continue right here, inshallah. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامِ. So we talked about wal-arham here. Al-arham, is this supposed to be an oath, or is this ittaqullah and alladhi tasa'aluna bihi, what you will be asked about, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as your as the center? Have you taken Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as your center? Have you taken Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as your reference? Have you taken Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as your place of guidance or not? Wal arham, because you will also be asked about al arham. Yeah, so you will be asked about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you will also be asked about the relationships that you have with your relatives. And we said al arham are different than al ashar, because al sihr is the marital relations. So what do we mean by marital relations? We mean by that, let's say you get married, the in-laws, okay? The in-laws, that's different than the biological relations, because it's also different than the milk relations. Milk relations are different in Islam. Milk relations are different. Milk relations don't take the same rulings as al-arham. What is al-arham? Al-arham are biological relations. Your brothers, your sisters, your mother, your uncles, your aunts, okay? Those are basically those kind of relations. The ashar relations are the in-laws. So the relationship between you and your biological relations up until the cousins. When it comes to the cousins, they don't have the same rights as your brothers and sisters. Your mother and father don't have, well, your brothers don't have the same rights as your mother and father, right? So think of it as like an orbit. You got right there, that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You've got the mother and your father, your brothers and your sisters, then your aunt, your uncles and your aunts, and then you've got the farther relationship, which is your cousins, okay? So the relationship that your mother and father have, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. Mother and father, they actually carry a relationship that is a totally different relationship. In fact, it's near al-bir that you would do for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right? Now, brothers and sisters, that's basically al-arham. Brothers and sisters are basically al-arham. The uncles, now that's why, really interesting for al-madhab al-Hanafi, if, for example, you ended up somehow having your share, let's just say this, remember, back then, slavery, one of the main entrances for slavery was during war, basically the hostages during war, okay? So let's just say that the hostage or the slave that you ended up basically taking, that is your share, was actually your brother or your mother and father, you would have to free them. Even if they're not Muslim, even if they're not Muslim. Why? Because of this ayah, at least for al-madhab al-Hanafi. They said, this is a rahim. This is a rahim. You can't enslave your own rahim. You can't enslave your own rahim. There's a certain relationship that's supposed to be honorable. And that's why even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even laid out the foundation of relationships and laid out of justice and relationships, in Allah ya'muru bil-adli wal-ihsan, that the Lord Almighty orders justice and al-ihsan. Al-ihsan is another level. And what? And ati dhal qurba. What was it? No. We're confusing another ayah. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى. إيتاء ذي القربى. And what if the boundary, the relationship, وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي. وإيتاء ذي القربى. So here al-arham are different than al-ashab. So what about al-ashab? My in-laws. Am I supposed to be relating to them? There's a very common question that people would ask me. Am I supposed to be responsible for my mother-in-law? Let's say my husband is at work and this is my mother-in-law. Am I responsible for her? And many times people will actually say, no, you're not responsible for her. That's a sihr, that's an in-law. You're not responsible for the father and the mother and whatever. Absolutely. And it's really sad that many times people don't recognize their boundaries. This is a very narrow view in understanding these relationships. It's a very narrow view to actually think, well, I'm not responsible for my mother-in-law. So why am I supposed to be taking care of her? It's his problem. How is it? It's his problem. It's your problem too. It's your problem. It is part of every single Muslim's responsibility to apply justice. And if not justice, al-ihsan. How can you see a woman with dementia and actually start treating her like she's nothing? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to be kind to animals, let alone with a woman that took care of your husband, the woman that bore your child, your husband, the grandmother, the grandfather of your own children. You want to tell me I'm not responsible for her? That's my husband's responsibility. And it's really important to understand this, because many times people, I'll share a comment. This comment, Jabir ibn Abdullah. Jabir ibn Abdullah, when he went with the Prophet ﷺ, on the way coming to Medina, sees Jabir ibn Abdullah and he tells him, did you get married? Because he recognized that Jabir ibn Abdullah was in a rush to go home. He said, yeah, I did. And he said, is it a virgin or not a virgin? In other words, did she have a marital experience from before? And he said, she's not. And he said, well, why didn't you marry a woman that never had a marriage experience before? And he said, well, my father basically died and left 7 girls for me to take care of. My 7 sisters, I needed someone to be like a mother to them, to take care of them. And the Prophet ﷺ told him, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless your marriage. One comment was on social media that was, that was, you know, just a comment. Someone said, well, Islamically, she doesn't have to take care of his sisters. Look at the comment. The least I could call it is stupid. Wanting to teach the Prophet ﷺ what Islam says. This is the Prophet ﷺ telling Jabir ibn Abdullah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless your marriage, for taking consideration, and this is fiqh. We're talking about fiqh. This is fiqh. Understanding the relationships and the responsibilities at a practical level. Not as you know, some reductionist level in where it's not my responsibility, it's his responsibility, and I have nothing to do with this. And it's like, oh, you could just watch somebody that is in need, that is probably on dialysis, that is struggling to eat, that is struggling to drink, that is struggling, probably Parkinson's disease, struggling to even carry their water. And you just want to look at them and say, it's not my responsibility. Where's al-ihsan? Where's al-iman? And this is very common that comes to me, especially with the in-laws. It's not my responsibility. How did we come to that degree where we could see somebody in need or even understand that, oh, we're actually supposed to be splitting this? This really reminds me of a very famous definition for marriage. What is the definition? That in the 5th, 6th century Hijriya, there was a definition for marriage that was very common. And what was that definition? The permissibility of a man having pleasure in a woman. The permissibility, that's the definition of marriage. From that definition, which is really problematic, but the reason why some of the fuqaha had defined marriage as that is because what they are really looking into is, where does the fine line of marriage and crime fall in? Marriage and zina. Where's that fine line? How do we actually put in this fine line? They didn't use the word consent, but it was, we're talking about a relationship that is permissible, that is regarded as halal relationship, and bi'adamiyya. Now, here's one thing, is that some scholars took this definition and regarded it as the foundation that they would see the relationship between a woman and a husband. In where the debate, is a woman responsible to work in her husband's home? Is she responsible to bring a glass of water? Is she responsible to clean? Is she responsible to work at home? Is she responsible to clean the house, fix the bed, whatever it is? Here's one problem, is that many would actually take this debate and say, well, here it is. And especially when you would see dua standing on pulpits and saying, well, you know, Islam doesn't order women to work at home because she's not supposed to be responsible for all of that. And of course, feeding the many feminist sentiments out there and not really understanding fiqh. The reason why fuqaha had given this definition is because they were really trying to canonize, where does the halal relationship start and where does it end? In other words, what would be a crime and what would be a halal relationship? They were putting in a canonized statement for people to recognize their boundaries. But to take that statement and actually say, well, that means a woman doesn't have to work at home, etc. Well, why don't we even understand how Sayyidah Aysha, she said about the Prophet, يَقُومُ فِي مِهْنَةِ أَهْلِهِ. He would actually do the work and the job of his own wives. What does that mean? His wives' jobs were to actually clean, fix at home, and do a lot of things. If you want to talk about justice, how is it justice that, yes, he's basically, if we were to use that statement, that definition as for marriage, you would want to regard that, oh, he's going to be responsible, out to work, being the breadwinner, and also when he comes back home, he's basically going to do all the things. The wife, according to this definition, is supposed to have just one job. You all understand what I'm talking about. How on earth is that supposed to be practical or even fair or even just at all? Are you serious? Are you serious? And of course, now mind you that the fuqaha would even say that he's also supposed to give her rights. So she's right there just sitting down like a queen, just waiting. Sorry, but this is not making sense. This doesn't make sense. There's no way that this is practical at all. And that's why there are many times where you would see certain people that might actually take out of context different quotes and then would say, well, Islamically, I don't have a responsibility toward my in-laws. I don't have a responsibility toward my mother-in-law. She can't do this. And not recognizing that in Islam, embracing akhlaq and embracing Islam and embracing justice is in itself taqwa. That's taqwa. If taqwa is not going to be in dealing with the people around you, whether they're biological relations or whether it's the in-laws or whether it's the farther area or whether it's the people on the street, then what is taqwa? What is taqwa going to be in? The hardest part about taqwa is really when it comes to وَأُحْضِرَتِ الْأَنفُسِ الشُّحَّ. What is وَأُحْضِرَتِ الْأَنفُسِ الشُّحَّ? Each and every single one of us, it's part of our own instinct that once you get near my property, we all of a sudden become fierce, angry, and ready to attack. You see them children, they would be 2 years old and they would say, mine. That's the first word that they learn, mine. And you come close, they're ready to bite, they're ready to scratch, they're ready to attack. It's their instinct. And even us as adults, once you get near the property, then that's when our akhlaq goes away. That's why with co-wives, they start getting dara'ir. They start attacking one another because each one is considering that this man is mine. That's why when we want to talk about taqwa, the real taqwa is when, despite the shared property, whether we're talking about shared property, individual like a husband, of course, and a husband is not a property, it's actually a manfa. It's very strange. You know what that means? So many women would consider that the husband is a property. Okay? But he's not actually a property. There's a particular manfa, there's a particular benefit. So once we look, we're going to talk about polygamy in just a bit. We're going to talk about polygamy in just a bit. Now, is a woman a man's property? Or is it a manfa? Is it the same thing? The relationship in Islam between a man and a woman is different than a relationship between a woman and a man. The dynamic is not the same. Wait a minute. I know you're like, what? Let's look at the ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَامْرَأَتُهُ حَمَّالَةَ الْحَطَبِ. What is وَامْرَأَتُهُ? And his woman, who was referring to Abu Lahab. He called it his woman. All right? And here, خَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا. But it was talking about the nafs. But here he said, وَامْرَأَتُهُ حَمَّالَةَ الْحَطَبِ الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ وَالْمَرْأَةُ رَاعِيَةٌ فِي بَيْتِ زَوْجِهَا. I don't want to say she's his property, but he definitely, there's a different level of authority. وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. It's not complete equity like a lot of the liberal system wants to portray it. In Islam, no, it's not complete equity. Because the ayah is really clear about it. وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. That there is a certain level. When we're talking about level, we're talking about responsibility. It's not saying that it's property. We're not saying property, but what we are saying is that it's not necessarily the complete relationship in the same way. That's what I'm saying. It's not the same way. All right? It's not the same way. That's why she obeys him. Does he have to obey her? No, he doesn't. Why doesn't he have to obey her? Why does he have to obey her? He's al-qawwam. Does your husband take your permission to leave the house?
He was the responsible.
Hold on. Does your husband take your permission to leave the house? Can I go to work, my dear? He doesn't have to. But the Prophet ﷺ emphasized that the woman has to take her husband's permission. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said, your husband is jannatuki wa narik. He's your jannah and he's your nar. Why? And this is extremely important because it's really sad that in our society, we have been so indoctrinated by the feminist ideas that when it comes to obedience to the husband, right away everyone is ready to somehow attack you because they would take that connotation is considering that a woman is like a slave. All right, they're ready to attack. But here, the Prophet ﷺ, it's when you look at the relationship, the Prophet ﷺ said, Jannatuki wa narik, your husband, he's basically your path to Jannah and your path to hellfire. And it's really sad that whenever this is talked about, women don't want to hear this because they basically they have been so fed, indoctrinated with the feminist views that they're just ready to attack. It's like ready to attack.
There's no taqwa.
No taqwa, no taqwa. It's like, wait a minute. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you right there informative clause telling you, there's a certain thing. You want balance within your household. You need to consider that the Prophet ﷺ and the ayat were always emphasizing the importance of obedience to the husband, literally obedience. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ literally said, فَإِنَّهُنَّ عَوَانٌ عِنْدَكُمْ. You know what al-ani is? He literally said, he was asking the men to take care of the women and to be kind to them. And he said, why? He explained it. So semicolon right there, فَإِنَّهُنَّ عَوَانٌ عِنْدَكُمْ. Because they're awan. You know what al-awan is? Al-ani is basically the hostage. So she's like a hostage in your home. The Prophet ﷺ is basically telling you, you gotta be really careful. You gotta take care of them. Have taqwa with the women because they're in your home, mending everything. And she literally is contributing all that she can within your household. She's like a hostage in your home. She can't leave but without your permission. She can't go to work but without your permission. All the different things, even to go to the masjid, she needs your permission. Even to fast, she needs your permission. Even all of that to basically without your, that's like a hostage. That's like a hostage. So the Prophet ﷺ is ordering them, have taqwa. Don't abuse their obedience to you. That's what the Rasul is literally saying. Don't abuse. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the ayah in Surah Nisa, we're going to get to it. الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. And then the end of the ayah, what does it say? That whoever would transgress that limit, إن الله كان عليا كبيرا. إن الله كان عليا كبيرا. Whoever would transgress that limit or abuse women's weakness or abuse even their consideration for piety to be obedient to their husbands. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, well, he's going to actually partake it from you. It's going to come and snap at you. Oh man, for your Lord Almighty is Ali. He's most high. And he is most big. He's most magnificent. There's no way. If you're going to abuse her weakness, there's no way that you can run away from the Lord Almighty's retaliation. That's it. That's it. Here's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically telling the man. This is a threatening statement. It's a threatening statement. So here, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامِ, this is in order to, yes, emphasize women relations, the women relations meaning the women relatives, and also emphasizing that one is supposed to have taqwa with the rahim, with the relatives. Why the relatives? Because usually the relatives are the most ones, and I always say this, your relatives are the most ones to transgress the limits with you. Why do they transgress the limits with you? They usually transgress the limits with you because they abuse knowing your places of weaknesses. They recognize your areas of weakness. They recognize, and of course, the more you know about a person, and this is important, the more you know about a person, the less fear you have. That's why politicians and leaders, they tend to keep distances between them and people. Why? Because they recognize that the more you deal with a person, the more transparent you become to them, the more human you become to them. So what do these politicians do? They try to keep distance away from the masses. And that's why a lot of women from this point, a lot of women lose their honor. You know, from what angle? Not the physical one, but because of the amount they share about themselves. They share too much. With other people, with men, with other people, with women, they end up wanting to speak about themselves. They ventilate, they talk about themselves. All of that, it makes you more exposed. The more exposed you are, the less honor you will be able to keep. You got to be careful. And the more you share about your challenges, the more vulnerable you become. You know why? Because people will start defining you based on your challenges. Don't share your challenges. Don't share your traumas. Don't share your privacies. Don't share your weak points, because then people will abuse and consider you more vulnerable for their own ego to take over. And you've got a lot of evil. It takes one person to attack your home. One person to attack your home. That's all you need. One person. So you've got to be careful. وَآتُوا الْيَتَامَى أَمْوَالَهُم. Speaking about vulnerable, now it goes, well, I want you, آتُوا الْيَتَامَى أَمْوَالَهُم. Since it was talking about the vulnerable, the women, talking about the vulnerable, the family, talking about all of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, I want you to have taqwa. The taqwa to consider the principles of the Lord Almighty. Since we're speaking about those vulnerable, now we're going to talk about the other type of vulnerable people, and those are the orphans. وَآتُوا الْيَتَامَ أَمْوَالَهُمْ, and give الْيَتَامَ أَمْوَالَهُم. So, الْيَتِيم is supposed to be the person that is an orphan. Mother and father died. All right? Now, when the ayah says, وَآتُوا الْيَتَامَ أَمْوَالَهُمْ, does that mean we would basically see, let's say, a 5-year-old orphan, we would say, well, here's your $50,000 your dad left behind? No. Al-yatim ceases to be a yatim or an orphan when they reach the age of puberty. They're not a yatim anymore. Once they reach the age of puberty, they're not an orphan. Because Islam regards that once the person reaches the age of puberty, they're now adults. All right? An adult means that they're supposed to be holding responsibility and not dependent on others. That's what it means. But what about this ayah when it says, "And give al-yatama amwalahum"? So does that mean we give them? No, this is actually from the stance, just like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about the Sahara, the magicians, that when they made sujood, they ceased to be magicians the second they believed. But this is to let you know what it's referring to. All right? So this is not to tell you somebody that is a yatim, a 5-year-old, give them their money. No, because there's supposed to be a wali. There's a wali or al-wasi. What's the difference between wali and wasi? Il-wali would be the second guardian or the first guardian for a person. So if, for example, the father is not there, then the grandfather would be the next wali, the following wali. The grandfather would be the following wali. If the grandfather is not there, then we would go to the uncles. The uncles are not there, then we would go to the brothers, and so forth, with differences of opinions between scholars on which one, and let me say the tree of who becomes next wali. And can a woman's son be a wali or not, or etc. The wali is not only for a woman. The wali is not only for a woman. The wali can be for anybody that is also vulnerable. Whether we're talking about a yatim, whether we're talking about somebody that is disabled, mentally disabled, that would be needing a wali. If there is no wali, there can be a wasi. What is al-wasi? Go ahead, my dear.
Regarding the wali, it has to be on the mother or father side, so it doesn't matter.
It does matter. Al-wali can only be from the father's side, period. Al-wali can never be from the mother's side. Never is the wali from the mother's side. The wali is only from the father's side. Good question. So your maternal uncle is never your wali. Your paternal uncle is your wali. Unless
So when you get married,
I fell in that trap. But
you
okay.
fell in that trap. Okay, here we go.
Dr. Aysha, during marriage or what?
Generally speaking, al-wali is supposed to be from al-asaba, supposed to be from the father's side, not the mother's side.
What about the mahram?
La, al-mahram is different. Good question. Al-mahram is different. Al-mahram can be anybody that you cannot marry. So your brothers, your maternal uncles, your brothers in rada'a, and sisters in your the milk relations, those can be mahram. All right, al-mahram is different. Al-mahram can even be from al-ashar, from the in-laws. Your father-in-law can be mahram to you. That's different. So mahram relations is different than responsibility. All right? Mahram relations is different than responsibility. Go ahead.
No, you open it there. It's not as maybe that the
In front of your father-in-law?
no, the mahram, that the one, the
The mahram, yes, if he's a mahram, you can unhijab yourself. All right, you can your brothers-in-law are not mahram. Okay, your brother-in-laws, they're not mahram. Exactly. So I'm talking about we're going to talk about that in inshallah. Where was I? Al-wasi. Al-wasi can be assigned by al-qadi, by the judge, and can be assigned. So what is al-wasi? Al-wasi is basically, what is al-wasi in English? It would be the guardian. It would be the guardian, but it's different than al-wali because that's an assigned guardian by either the judge or probably, let's say right here in Minnesota, it could be the assigned guardian by probably the state or the qadi or the judge or probably even the wali himself. So they basically take, let's call it, we're giving them a power of attorney to take care of them and take care of their matters. Okay, so that would be a wasi. It's a specific kind of guardianship. But this person is not the wali, but the wasi can also take over and act as the wali if the power of attorney included, let me say, more expanded responsibilities and rights over that person. Got it? Let's give an example. Let's say a Somali girl, okay, refuge, came to America, and basically her maternal uncle was the wasi. The girl's father back in Africa, he basically told her maternal uncle or, the person to be the wasi, to take care of all her matters, because he doesn't have access to helping her probably get married, probably taking care of her money, probably taking all of that. So he becomes the wasi, acting as also something similar to the wali. All right. So in that situation, that would be kind of like giving him a power of attorney that you act on my behalf. But al-wasi does not necessarily mean he's a mahram. Al-wasi can be a person that was given a power of attorney to act on behalf of somebody, but not necessarily a mahram. There's a difference. All right, we're giving him a power of attorney to help mitigate, to help do certain things, to help you solve certain things, but that's not necessarily supposed to be always a mahram. A mahram is a different thing, because a mahram can either be through marriage, biological, or milk relations. Let's go for the milk relations. We talked about the biological. We talked about in ashar, the in-laws. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the milk relations. Milk relations are not arham. In milk relations, what is a milk relation? A milk relationship basically means that, let's just assume, okay, here's a milk relationship. Let's just assume, here we go, this woman basically nursed this boy or girl, okay? This woman becomes a milk mother to this boy / girl. Her husband becomes the milk father to this boy girl, all right? And this couple's children, they basically become this boy girl siblings. But this boy is biologically the son of another person. This woman's children are not related to this group, but they are biologically related to this boy. Got it? They share the same mother and father. You guys understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay. Now, milk relations, they don't inherit from one another. There's no inheritance. Not because he's your milk brother, there's no inheritance. Do we have to do silat al-rahim the same way that you would actually do with silat al-rahim with biological relations? No. You don't have to connect with them the same way. Financial responsibilities. Do we do it the same way? No. No, not the same way. If my milk sister probably got divorced or she needed help, etc., am I responsible? I'm not responsible. But it would be good to contribute. At the end of the day, Muslim sister. And definitely when a person has milk relations with you, is definitely closer than a person that doesn't have milk relations. If we are asked to be good for somebody that is not even of any relationship, how is it with somebody that we have some kind of a relationship? So this is part of al-amana. All right, so these are the types of 3 relationships. So here, وَآتُوا الْيَتَامَى أَمْوَالَهُم. آتُوا الْيَتَامَى أَمْوَالَهُم. So do we actually give the orphans their money? Notice that the ayah said أَمْوَالَهُم, their money. So when do we actually give it to them? What does that even mean? There is a context to this ayah. The context is the Arab, they had many times, of course, abused the relationship with the orphans because they are vulnerable. They would take these orphans and definitely all the money that they had inherited, and they would consider, well, this is an investment. They'll take the orphan and take all the money and include it, and they'll be like, well, here we go. I've got a child here. I'll take their money, and now their money and this child becomes mine, becomes my property, basically, because I'm taking care of them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was emphasizing that part, that no, for the orphans, you have no right to take over their money. You have no right. So how am I going to help the child? Am I supposed to be basically here the child? I'm going to be spending on the child and keeping their money as a savings? No. You're going to use that money, but in a way that is, let me say, spending it for their care. So you can use the money, but on a condition that you act with justice. In other words, you don't take all their money and basically spend it on all your expenses, but you would basically calculate how much is every child probably costing? How many children do I have? I've got 5 children. This is how much we're paying monthly expenses. This is how much our expenses are. This is how much every child is probably costing. And of course, not every child would cost the same way. You know, a child that's probably 10 years old is costing probably different than a child that's 3-year-old, etc., depending on the different needs and all of these different things. And of course, and somebody that is ill definitely needs more medical bills and the other one that doesn't need it. So it depends on the child. But at the end of the day is that you would do this calculation based on estimation, not by the penny, but based on estimation, and estimate how much it would actually cost to cover this child's expenses, and you would basically use that money for the children. But when you look at آتوا اليتامى أموالهم ولا تتبدلوا الخبيث بالطيب, what is ولا تتبدلوا? Literally the word says, and don't make a trade-off with whatever is impure with something that is pure. Now this goes on al-matruk. What is al-matruk? Whatever you are leaving. So this ayah is basically saying, well, don't take a tayyib, which is your money, and take what is impure. And this is not saying impure. Impure doesn't mean that it has najasa, because impurity, just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ. Impurity, we usually think of it as urine, feces, all these different things. No, even a behavior can be an impurity. Anything that is not based on principle or good would actually be an impurity. Anything that is good would be tayyib. So if it's good behavior, it can be tayyib, can be tahir. So when we talk about tahir, tahara, it can be physical purity and it can be moral purity, actions. So here, وَلَا تَتَبَدُّلُ الْخَبِيثَ بِالطَّيِّبِ, don't replace al-khabith. In other words, don't give away a tayyib, which is your own money, and try to take something that doesn't belong to you. وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَهُمْ إِلَىٰ أَمْوَالِكُم. The word تَأْكُلُوا actually means to gulp up, to eat up their wealth and add it to your wealth. So what is that supposed to mean? Don't combine your wealth and their wealth and mix it up in order for you to just, where it's unnoticeable. You would, it's like unnoticeable, people don't even recognize. They would just, oh, it's a shared account for tax purposes. We made it joint account, and we made all the different legal things in order to hide the reality of our intentions, when it's probably not necessarily just wanting to make a joint account. It's probably in order to put all the money where nothing is noticeable of how this was all blended in. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, no, لا تأكلوا ولا تأكلوا. Don't eat up. Now, the word تأكلوا actually means eat up, but in English, well, even in Arabic, that's actually a metaphor to mean where you're gulping up or you're taking in, or you are including your wealth with their wealth, with your wealth, in order to hide the reality. Because when you eat something, you don't know what I ate. It's all gone. Well, something else will probably show. The obesity is probably going to show what I gulped up, but at the end of the day, is that a lot of it might not actually be noticeable. إِنَّهُ كَانَ حُوبًا كَبِيرًا. It is حُوبًا. What is حُوبًا or حَوْبًا? What is حُوبًا? حُوبًا actually means a transgression. الحوب is transgression. So when you look at transgression and where it is an ithm, it is a transgression, it is a sin, it is an oppression, it's a form of committing a sin where you're crossing the boundaries. In other words, there's a boundary of how you use the money and where you're using it, and it's a great huban. Should we stop here or should we continue?
We should stop here.
We should stop here? Fair enough. So we'll stop here next week. Friday, inshallah, we're going to talk about polygamy, mathna wa thalatha wa ruba'.
What does manfa' mean? Sorry, I didn't get that.
Manfa', did I say manfa'?
What was the word?
Huban kabira. Husband is a manfa'.
Yeah.
Manfa' actually means a place of usage, maybe? Sorry, ladies. All right, a benefit?
A benefit.
A benefit, there you go, it's a benefit.
They don't like that though.
What?
They
Who
don't
does?
like to have that. Some of them.
Well, I mean,
But
yeah, so
from
you,
what I
a
know.
place of benefit, but it's not your property.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
Not your
what I
property.
mean is that they don't like to be used. Some of them don't like to be used.
You mean the men?
Yeah.
I'm not, okay. I'm not saying you're using, okay? I'm not saying that in that way,
Okay.
all right? I'm just trying to break down how we view the relationship, okay? So you could, for a woman, the relationship in our society, they would consider it that, hey, it's a mutual thing, this much to you, this much to me. Yes, you have to do this and I have to do this. And it becomes like it's a mutual thing and where we're all on the same level. Islam was really clear about it there. No, you are not at the same level. He is not at your same level. And we're not here talking about a same level of humanity. Same level of humanity, of course you're at the same level of humanity. There's no doubt about that. That's what that ayah is actually saying. خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ. So when it comes to humanity, yes, you're at the same level. He's not any better, he's not superior, and you're not inferior, if we're talking about the level of humanity. But when we're talking about the level of responsibility, level of authority, level of what each one is doing and what type of role they're taking in, it's not the same. Islam was really clear about it. It's not the same.
What about financially?
Even financially, he's the one financially responsible. You're not.
Yeah, but if now it's not only him who is financially.
Yeah.
If you're,
not like that. That's how
we're gonna talk about that, inshallah. Fair enough. There's actually a lot to say about the finances because this is becoming one main reason for a lot of the marital problems is that a woman's contribution within the household, and of course the impact it has on how much I contribute in decision making. That's stay tuned for next week. Or Friday, inshallah.
Can you explain this for me a little bit? So Rabbakum, I mean taqwa, Rabbakum, and taqwa.
Okay, so ittaqu rabbakum.
Yeah.
You're having taqwa. Really, it's really for one Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, both are actually going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when you say ittaqu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum, it's basically telling you, well, I want you to recognize your Lord Almighty that actually created you. Why that created you? Because Rabb is actually the one that created, is the one that gives you rizq. Rabb is the one that cherishes you in all corners, all right, without the maintenance. So think of Rabb as the one to give you the maintenance, okay? Ilah is basically the higher supreme power. You see it? The higher supreme. When you're looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the power stance, that becomes where it's supreme power. You're relating and recognizing that he's a deity where there's no higher and a more supreme power than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this one, Rabb, is relating and reaching out to you from considering your weakness. There's a difference. When I would tell you, for example, I would talk to you, Mom, take care of your son. All right. I'm talking to you from the stance of Mom, take care of your son. But if I were to say, probably, even though I'm going to say the same statement, take care of your son. But if I were to say, you're the guardian, take care of your son. You see the difference? When I say, Mom, take care of your son, it comes with a connotation that I'm actually asking you to give some form of affection. But when I'm saying guardian, parent, what is that? Some form of authority, power, restrictions, laws. You see what I'm saying? And here, this is actually, ittaqu rabbakum, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, listen, recognize that your weakness. You see it right there? Recognize your weakness. Why did he start with recognizing our weakness? Because he wants to tell you, listen, don't abuse your power. That's why he said, don't abuse your power, because there is no higher than the hierarchy of the Lord Almighty. But he started out with asking you to recognize your weakness, your vulnerability. Think of your vulnerability when you are at a position of guardianship, a position of attorney when dealing with the women or dealing with the orphans. Got it? So that's why that ayah, ittaqu rabbakum, it started out with telling you, I want you to remember your vulnerability. Remember, you were created from nothing, from one soul, and even the woman that was with it, you cannot consider that she is inferior in any way because خَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا. He had created its own pair for it. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to also hint to those that are listening, especially the Arabic society that was always regarding women as inferior, wanted to say, listen, I don't want you to abuse that, because I want you to consider and remember that that creature slash woman that you are regarding as inferior is actually your pair, is actually what you need. Therefore, you cannot abuse. So that's why الذي تساءلون به والأرحام. It's like, I want you to consider there's a hierarchy. That is the Lord Almighty. So you got to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that's what you're going to be asked about. And you're also going to be asked about their relatives and how you had treated them. Because most of the times, most transgressions, most abuse actually comes from the relatives. Actually comes from the relatives. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling you, Inna Allah kana alaikum raqiba. He is watching you. He is watching you. So don't abuse your relationship. Don't abuse your power. Don't abuse the information that you know about your relative that others don't know. Don't abuse that. This is it. That's why, inshallah, we'll continue next week and talking about وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى. Friday. Inshallah. There you go. I keep on saying next week. So this is it. Wasiyah is written will, which is a third person of a wealth. It doesn't have to be over wealth. Wasiyah doesn't have to be over wealth. It can be over other things, and where kind of like a guardianship over either a power of attorney. So we're looking at a power of attorney can be a restricted power of attorney to do certain things, and it can be full power of attorney to do even more than a particular thing. Go ahead,
Is there
my
a
dear.
need for a witness to be there when they're getting that power?
Is there for the weakness
No, a witness. I mean, witness to be there when he's getting that.
with the wasiyah?
Yeah.
Oh, Jamil. So in wasiyah, there has to be with al-wasiyah, there has to be the witnesses to make sure that we're basically granting and that there's a responsibility. And definitely right now, al-wasiyah, in order to make a power of attorney, it has to be notarized.
Yeah.
Okay, so right now you can notarize the wasiyah. You can go to the bank, or you can probably go to UPS and actually notarize that, hey, we're signing here, you and I, or whatever, we're signing either a restricted power of attorney or even a full power of attorney. It doesn't have to be over wealth. It can be over probably doing certain things, maybe taking care of somebody, maybe taking care of a property, maybe taking care of, maybe doing and engaging a certain particular action. All right. So inshallah, we'll continue next week.
Allahu Akbar.
That's okay. Huh, my
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله